We're joined today by music journalist Gary Graff, and we're talking about his new book, 501 Essential Albums of the 90s, The Music Fan's Definitive Guide. Gary, how are you today?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me. Are you kidding?
You've got a new book out here, 501 Essential Albums of the 90s, The Music Fan's Definitive Guide. I mean, it says it all there in the title, but can you tell the listeners a bit about the new book?
Yeah, so it is, like you say in the title, 501 Essential Albums of the 90s. And we sat down and, hashed out a list of the albums we felt are, the title says it, essential. It means, and that's the tag to put on it. If an album is essential, if it's something that at least to understand that decade in music, and we have done an 80s book, and there will be other decades, but to understand that decade in music, these are the ones we think you have to hear, you have to listen to.
And you really leave no genre or style out. I love that you say right off the bat, this is a book that's going to be starting arguments.
It did just in picking the 501, including in my own house. There was a little bit of headbutting over which albums were going to be in the book. It was a tough task. What a fun exercise, but a tough task. It's tough, really. There are some years, we're on this year we're on the 40th anniversary of 1984. If you remember what a great year of music that was, it would probably be hard to come up with 501 albums from 1984. That year alone, much less an entire decade. And we experienced that in figuring out, 501 from the 90s. What do you leave out? And there was a bloodletting, and there were some personal favorites of mine that are not in here. But I will stand by this group of albums that we came up with as being the 500 ones that are key to really knowing what the decade was all about.
It is interesting when you think of the 90s. It seems like every genre you can imagine was on the top of the charts at one time or another. I mean, you had country and metal and swing music, techno. I think Tejano was big for a while. It's like every genre you can think of was on the radio back then.
Sure. Hip hop, EDM certainly experienced an explosion there. Americana, then the 90s was where we started calling whatever that was Americana. And we finally came up with a name for what we were calling country rock or rock and country or something. It really was an explosion of music, one decade builds off another, of course. So really the success that music experienced in the 80s and what MTV did for building a music audience, exponentially grew it. So you had that many more people buying, and this is a key point, buying records during the 90s, because it was at the end of the 90s that we started getting into the file sharing and the BitTorrents and Napster and the concept that we now know as the main way people consume music, which is streaming and downloading. So in a lot of ways, the 90s was the last golden decade for the music business. And, you can see that in the albums that are in here, whether it's Metallica's Black Album or Appetite for Destruction from Guns N' Roses or Santana's Supernatural. These were albums that were selling a million copies in their first week out. And that stopped happening during the 2000s. So I really do think, like I said, this was the last of the golden eras in the music business.
Well, you mentioned it a little bit, but obviously there's more than 501 albums that came out in the 90s. Did you start with like a list of 5,000 and then have to pare it down? Or, I mean, how do you even get to this point?
I think the long list was about 2,000.
Okay.
That we came up with. And then we bounced it around, between myself and some of the contributors and the people at the publisher. And, we bounced around and finally came down to the 501. And it's interesting. You realize things like, there are certain artists who are not in this book at all, including some big names like, James Taylor or Jackson Brown, Joni Mitchell, I don't think. And, that's where you had to make the hard choices and realize that they released some, certain artists released some very good albums in the 1990s, but they weren't essential albums, and they weren't even essential albums in those artists' career.
Sure.
So, you have some people who aren't in here. And, it felt funny until we realized, what that last thing I said, that, that wasn't even essential to that artist's career. So it certainly wasn't essential to the decade.
Sure. Again, Gary Graff is with us, and we're talking about his new book, 501 Essential Albums of the 90s, The Music Fan's Definitive Guide. And I would say for the listeners out there, this isn't just a list of albums. You've got background on the albums and why they're important and who was influenced by them. I mean, this is really a great reference book for music fans.
Yeah, we do have a lot of analysis. I mean, we make the case, sometimes in short form, sometimes in longer entries. We make the case for why this is an essential album. And I should note too that while I'm the editor and I guess guiding force of this book, there are 36 contributors who were part of this, writers, journalists, musicians who wrote for the book, music aficionados who I know and who are very articulate and thoughtful and were part of the book as well. So you get different voices. I'm a generalist as a music journalist, but it's good to get more expert voices involved in this than just my voice.
One thing I realized when I was looking through it, it seems like the 90s was really maybe the last decade where you saw a lot of huge selling soundtracks. I know there have been some since, but I mean, like Reality Bites and The Bodyguard and Dangerous Minds. I mean, soundtracks were really a big business in the 90s.
They were, and again, growing off the 80s, and it was introduced really in the 60s. You think about all those Broadway cast albums and old school movie score albums that sold really well in the 60s. And so the music business liked to focus on movies, and then in the 70s with things like Saturday Night Live or Urban Cowboy, you got the multi-artist, the jukebox sort of soundtrack. And then, like you said, we've got quite a few of them, in this book, and they should be. They were, we did listen to we bought these as albums, we consumed them as albums, just the same way we would consume an individual artist album. And there were a lot of big soundtrack hits during the 90s, without a doubt.
It seems like this music from the 90s is really coming back into to vogue again, I guess. A lot of people my age are really nostalgic for this music when we were in high school. And, sometimes I forget the 90s was not 10 years ago. It was actually 30 years ago at this point.
I was having just that conversation with somebody at a funeral today, actually. But we were talking about that and remembering, in this case, what we were doing during the 80s. And like, yeah, that was 40 odd years ago. And now the 90s are, 24 years at least, since the 90s, and 24 to 34 years ago, really. And that is a long time ago. And it's usually when you get into that 20-year realm is when you start to see nostalgia for a particular period of time, certainly by 25. So the 90s, we've certainly had a lot of 80s nostalgia going on in the last few years, the last decade maybe. So yeah, the 90s number is probably up, and time to start thinking about it.
It's hard to imagine. I'm sure it'll happen, but the early aughts and that time period, it's hard to be nostalgic for that. I'm sure people will be, though.
It's too soon. It really is too soon. Plus, we're living it, and especially when we talk about music or even popular culture, in 2024, we are still consuming things and enjoying our entertainment in a way that's not too different from what we did during the aughts, during the early 2000s. Whereas in the 90s, we all owned CD players. Some of us were trying mini disc players or DAT, digital audio tape. we were buying albums as albums. We were listening to an album all the way through, and just things that we don't do anymore. And that certainly distinguishes the 90s from the 2000s. So that's why I think, 2000 or 2004 doesn't feel as far away as 1994 does.
Well, Gary, I know this is probably not easy, but out of the 501 albums here in the book and the ones you mentioned that didn't make the cut, do you have a personal number one or one that you could say maybe was the most essential for you?
No. No, the short answer, of course, no. And you have to remember, I lived through these albums as a journalist too.
Sure.
So a lot of it's tied up into what was the experience of reporting on that album, reviewing it, talking to the creators of the albums. So those, it's really, really hard. I mean, I love the supernatural story, Santana. I love that Clive Davis took this guy who, was still a great musician, but, hadn't made a hit record in a long time, and put him together with all these unlikely people and, turned it into this massive selling album. And, Metallica, the Black Album, of course, I think a key album, Was Not Was, Are You Okay? Those first two Oasis albums, those first three Smashing Pumpkins albums. That's one of the other things that in the selection process becomes hard, and it became even harder during the 80s and will during the 70s and 60s too, is you had artists and bands putting out albums much more frequently. And, so how do you take somebody who had the output of a Metallica or a U2 or a Smashing Pumpkins or an Oasis, and do you take them and include them all, and take up those valuable slots, or do you have to pick and choose? And If you're going to do that, which do you pick and choose? So that becomes a factor too. We were talking favorites, Bruce Springsteen, The Ghost of Tom Joad, like we'd never heard him before. What a fabulous album. U2, Achtung Baby. So I think somewhere in there I gave you 5 and 6, and I'm going to cop out by not picking one. And you're going to have to live with that.
That's all right. It's I put you on the spot there, but again, the book just out here, 501 Essential Albums of the 90s, and I know you're always working on stuff. This was a huge undertaking, obviously, but do you have something maybe next that's maybe coming up here?
Well, 501 Essential Albums of the 80s will be out in the spring.
Okay.
Probably around May. So that'll be out. And I think that's one that'll start even more arguments, because I think there are even greater emotional ties to 80s music than there are to 90s music. So that'll be fun. There will be a lot of MTV watchers and, glam kids who are not going to be happy with me. I keep telling you, sometimes the contributors make fun of you. Oh, well, your name's going on the cover. I said, yeah, guess who gets all the crap? About what's not in the book.
Right.
They're not going to call you. So that's the next big one. And there are a few other major projects, and just, tons and tons of journalism. Folks can find me at Graff on Music on Twitter, Real Graff on Music on Instagram, Gary Graff on Music on Facebook, and that has a lot of the day-to-day journalism.
Excellent. Well, Gary, it's always great speaking with you, and I definitely love this new book, and I'm excited. Maybe we can speak again here coming up next year when the 80s one comes out.
You have it, and thank you so much for your support.
And again, that was music journalist Gary Graff. His latest book, 501 Essential Albums of the 90s, The Music Fan's Definitive Guide, is out now.